Turning our focus to, of course, a veteran who, of course, needs no introduction. And we are going to be speaking, in fact, in particular, about now next in the Indo-Pacific. Yes, this is a really talked about region, isn't it? The Indo-Pacific. We've seen a lot of shifting geopolitical stances, particularly in the last few years in this region. A lot of bilaterals, multilateral summits have focused on visions of countries for the Indo-Pacific, and we are very excited to hear the next speaker's vision also for the Indo-Pacific, and of course also India's position in the New World Order and his overall geopolitical views as well. He's someone who, of course, is no stranger to India. We've enjoyed very good ties with Australia under his leadership. I am, of course, talking about the 28th Prime Minister of Australia, who we are extremely privileged and honored to have with us in our midst today. Yes, our next guest of honor keynote address is by none other than Honorable Tony J. Abbott. As I said, the 28th Prime Minister of Australia. We also will be having a very interesting Q&A for him later. But first, over to you, Prime Minister Abbott, for your keynote address. We're really excited for it.
Well, thank you. It's been a fascinating day, but a long one. I won't keep you too much longer, but I do hope to give you something to talk about over dinner. I do think that events like this matter because they bring leaders and thinkers together from different perspectives, and that's vital because the world, as Stephen Harper reminded us this morning, is more fraught than in many years. The Ukraine war might soon end with Russian aggression rewarded. The Gaza war could soon peter out with Hamas, the terrorist group, intact. And China, as India is only too well aware, is constantly ratcheting up its belligerence, particularly against practically independent, free and democratic Taiwan. China, Russia, Iran, communist, militarist, Islamist dictatorships are in an alliance of convenience against free countries that have rarely been as divided and confused. Quite apart from the massive loss of life, the ramifications of the Ukraine war have included much higher global energy prices and food shortages, in a warning of how quickly even the best of times can change under leaders more set on world power than their people's well-being. Leadership matters, and here India's leadership has delivered the world's fastest economic growth, with rural India finally enjoying clean water, proper sanitation, reliable electricity and connectivity, while urban India is gaining mass transit systems, motorways, and an economic takeoff that's more soundly based than China's, thanks to democratic legitimacy and government under the rule of law. But the question I want to address is the one posed earlier to Prime Minister Harper. Is the Trump ascendancy going to do more good than harm? No new president has had more impact in his opening few weeks. Domestically, he's reversed the so-called green transition and stopped the policy preoccupation with climate change. He's ended the woke fixations of American boardrooms, including hiring practices based on immutable characteristics rather than character and talent. He's declared there's only two genders. He's tasked the world's greatest industrialist with making government more efficient. And he's ended the chaos in America's borders via the shock and awe tactic of threatening a 25% tariff unless Mexico in particular militarises its border to stop the daily inflow of thousands of undocumented foreigners and drug precursors. Well, so much, so good. But along the way, he's mocked the Prime Minister of Canada. He's mused about turning Gaza into a Miami beachfront. He said that the most beautiful word is tariff, threatening to upend the freer movement of goods, people and ideas that until recently had made the world more safe, more rich, more fair and more free for more people than ever before in history. And most worryingly, he's accused the Ukrainian president of being a dictator who started a war in order to ride an American gravy train pending a deal to give the US preemptive rights over Ukraine's strategic minerals. Only now to walk that back, suggesting that this president should always be taken seriously, but not always literally. So what's happened to Ronald Reagan's idea of America as a shining city on a hill and the last best hope of mankind, and to JFK's America that was ready to pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend and oppose any foe to assure the survival and success of liberty? Has it been replaced by fascination for powerful leaders disposed to bully their own citizens and invade their neighbours? Or is it simply a presidential desire to understand the difference between strength and weakness? My sense, and that's all it can be until more plays out, is that this president is shaking things up rather than changing his country's direction, because America's fundamental values and interests have not changed, not one bit. Tariffs, at least on friendly countries, don't protect industries so much as punish consumers. And the same common values, common interests, and yes, the same common anxieties that created the Quad are still there. President Trump is no less a patriotic believer in America's manifest destiny to be a beacon to the world's poor, huddled masses yearning to be free, no less an enthusiast for the power of market freedom to drive national wealth and personal opportunity, and no less committed to helping to build a more peaceful world where people can realise their dreams. It's just that where Kennedy saw American troops and advisers overseas as adding to his country's moral lustre, he worries that they could drag America into other people's wars. And where Reagan saw America's big fight as against the Soviet evil empire, this president sees the main struggle as against China's economic ascendancy based on exploiting free trade without practicing it. But so far, his verbal joustings have prompted a previously quasi-pacifist UK Labor government to lift military spending sharply and promise to police any ceasefire in Ukraine, and Middle Eastern governments that have long tolerated a terrorist statelet to consider how Gaza might be rebuilt other than as a sanctuary for apocalyptic Islamism. And even India has started to reduce its tariffs in order to make PM Modi's recent visit there a resounding success. It's hard to see a deal done behind Zelensky's back, if only because no president would want history to brand him the appeaser who'd sold out Ukraine to Russia the way Chamberlain sold out Czechoslovakia to Nazi Germany, or a deal with Xi over Taiwan, if only because no one determined to put America first would give its chief rival control of the sophisticated microchips essential to AI to power the next economic revolution. Countries' relationships with America will be more obviously transactional under this president, with less woolly rhetoric and more practical outcomes. Countries that want America's help should do more to help themselves and be more ready to give America a bigger stake in their freedom too. And if that means fewer restrictions on US investment and fewer green hurdles on economic development that China, for instance, can usually bribe its way around, then that's likely to leave the free world much better off. As J.D. Vance, the Vice President, recently warned, many democracies have been rolling back free speech in the guise of countering so-called misinformation or avoiding giving offence. To reduce emissions, we've damaged our competitiveness and deindustrialised. To atone for the old racism and sexism, we've started to discriminate again, only this time over identity. We've even started to deny democracy itself, excluding from government parties that take the wrong voters' concerns seriously. So as the antidote to military weakness, economic stagnation and cultural confusion, Donald Trump might not be the president the world likes, but he may very well be the president the world needs. Yes, as someone with a long memory and a mean streak, as the president himself admits in one of his books, it might be rhetorically brutal, at least in the short term. But the longer-term outcome of this presidency should be less of the self-destructive politics of climate and identity, and ultimately freer trade between like-minded democracies, plus stronger American allies. And this, of course, brings me to democratic India. Wonderful democratic India that's assimilated the rule of law and that now has the prospect of replacing China as the workshop of the world and becoming the supply chain partner that free countries can trust. When Prime Minister, a decade back, I used to call India the world's emerging democratic superpower. Under Modi, it has well and truly emerged as the world's second democratic superpower, and by God, don't we need another democratic superpower, and any unpredictability from the first will provide a great opening for the second. I'm confident that this will be the Indo-Pacific century. I hope that it turns out to be more India's century than China's century, and I believe that this is more likely if there is no American opt-out of all the world's struggles. God bless you, God bless India, and let's work together for a better world.
Thank you so much, Tony Abbott, for that address. You were really, of course, very topical on India's ties and, of course, India's position in the world, and also your candid views on the new US president and other issues were also much appreciated. But we're going to continue this conversation. You have set the tone and tenor, I think, for your vision and your view and perspective, of course, on multiple issues. But we're going to continue this conversation because with us now, and I'd urge you to stay back on stage, because with us now is another individual who will be in Q&A with you. He needs no introduction. He's, of course, someone who's been a veteran in India, in administration, in tourism, and, of course, also in foreign policy. He was steering the G20 when it was under India's presidency last year. And, of course, I'm talking about Amitabh Kant, former, G20 Sherpa, and, of course, former CEO, Niti Aayog. In fact, this very summit, Tony Abbott, sir, if I can tell you, this very venue was actually created specially for the G20 when we hosted, of course, the world's dignitaries. So let me quickly then call upon stage now Amitabh Kant to, of course, pose some very, very interesting questions to you for this special Q&A. We're privileged to have you, sir, with us. Thank you very much for consenting to be at the NXT Summit 2025 to do this special segment now with the 28th Prime Minister of Australia, Tony J. Abbott. And the floor is now yours, Mr. Kant.
So let me first compliment Mr. Abbott for a very visionary, a very dynamic and a very powerful speech. You've been a very key driver of Australia-India relationship, and you've played a very critical role in deepening and strengthening our relationship. I would urge you to be as frank as possible for our viewers. In the midst of all this geopolitical turmoil, tell us three key issues. Geopolitics, when is the war going to end in Europe? Number two, what is going to be the impact of making America great again on climate action? And number three, to my mind, how do you foresee the new forces of artificial intelligence and quantum computing impacting world around us in terms of production and productivity?
Well, thanks, Amitabh. Look, I hope the war in Europe ends as soon as possible, but I hope it ends on terms that are as just and as fair to the victim as possible. And plainly, Russia invaded Ukraine. There was no justification for the invasion of Ukraine, and any ceasefire that doesn't provide Ukraine with ongoing security, and that means serious European soldiers on the ground as a tripwire against any future Russian invasion, I think would give the aggressor a win. And if the aggressor wins in one place, potential aggressors in other places will be massively emboldened. So that's that one. Look, on climate change, I've got to be honest with you, I don't think climate change is the biggest problem we face. I don't even think it's the second or the third biggest problem we face. Obviously, here in India, the chief issue is trying to give more and more Indians a decent middle-class standard of living. And frankly, any attempt to reduce emissions that damages that is not worth doing. And at the moment, in countries of the West, Biden's America, Britain still, Australia still, Europe, this quest to reduce emissions is making us economically weaker, and ultimately it's hurting our efforts to compete with the dictatorships that wish us harm. So I think Trump in this area is a bracing gale of fresh air. Now, as for AI, it's going to make a huge difference, obviously, over time. But in the end, AI is just another tool. And it's the people that use the tool that really count. The tools are there to help us to do better. But anyone who's dominated by the tool is a fool.
Okay. No, so let's turn to another critical aspect, and that's the role of tariffs, because free trade has lifted vast segments of population above poverty line in the last few decades. It's had a huge impact in terms of growth and prosperity. With protectionism at such high levels and the complete breakdown of WTO, what implication does it have for Global South and for countries like Australia and India?
Okay, well, thanks, Amitabh. Look, the so-called Global South is vastly better off now than it was a generation ago. Inequality between countries is much less now than it was a generation ago. I think of the poor, in inverted commas, country that I know best, namely PNG, and you compare Port Moresby, say, 30 years ago to Port Moresby today, and it's chalk and cheese. Sure, there are a lot of poor people in Port Moresby. Yes, there's a lot of inequality of wealth in Port Moresby, but in many ways, it's now a sophisticated global city as well, Port Moresby. So globalisation has meant equalisation, and the reason for that is that a world with freer movement of goods, people and ideas has given the less well-off more chance to get ahead than ever before. There's no doubt that free trade makes everyone better off in the long run. In the short run, there can be quite difficult adjustments, and it's the job of democratic governments to try to smooth those difficult adjustments. One particular consequence of free trade, ever since China was brought into the WTO, is that China has exploited free trade but not practiced it. And this is where Prime Minister Modi showed rare courage and insight and great leadership when he refused to join the Chinese-led Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, because this, in the end, was just going to be another device like the Belt and Road Initiative for China to practice various forms of economic colonialism. So look, free trade is very important, but frankly, I am much more in favour of free trade with our friends, with like-minded democracies, than I am of free trade with those who wish to do us harm, such as Communist China under the present regime.
So you feel that when Chinese penetrate global markets, they're doing it with their companies being supported by state governments and their goods being subsidized to penetrate global markets? Exactly right.
What China has deliberately set out to do is to dominate critical markets, particularly emerging markets. Now, here in Australia, my country, we constantly hear this talk, oh, Australia is going to become a renewable energy superpower, as if no other country has wind or sun. In fact, the only country that is going to become a renewable energy superpower is China, because China is making the solar panels and the wind turbines that we are importing, often enough on the back of slave labour from the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province. Now, that's not the kind of thing that we want to participate in my view.
Yeah, but my concern really was about the last time when Mr. Trump withdrew from climate action and withdrew from the COP21 agreement. It led to China filling up that vacuum. And today it controls about 80% of the critical minerals. It controls 70% of electric vehicles, 75% of batteries, 60% of wind energy, 74% of solar energy. So this vacuum being created again, will this again provide a further impetus to China to create a greater, even a deeper monopoly?
But again, we are only buying electric cars because governments are subsidising them. If they weren't being subsidised, they wouldn't be being bought. We are only using wind and solar power because governments are forcing consumers to subsidise it. By far the cheapest form of reliable power remains coal. And countries like India and indeed China quite sensibly are continuing to develop coal-fired power. Now let's make the coal-fired power as clean as possible. Let's scrub all the particulates out. Let's make them supercritical coal-fired power stations so that their emissions are reduced as far as is possible. But my point is, none of us should pursue emissions reduction in ways which damages our citizens' cost of living and in ways which damages our economic competitiveness vis-à-vis our rivals, particularly China, which is the great strategic competitor.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks for that perspective. I greatly appreciate your perspective. Let me turn to another subject, and that's about global institutions. Many of these institutions were created post-World War II at a point of time when neither Sustainable Development Goals or climate action was a challenge, and we've seen United Nations becoming totally dysfunctional. Security Council is non-functional. We are seeing that the World Bank and International Monetary Fund are not able to meet the requirements of resources required for the global South. How do you see the global institutions transforming themselves in the coming era? And what do you think need to be done to hasten a far more representative character of these institutions?
Well, Amitabh, first thing I should say is that I think global institutions should be taken seriously, but I, for one, would never surrender the sovereignty of my country to dictation by a global institution. I would not. Particularly a global institution which is dominated by countries with very different sets of values and very different attitudes towards human rights, etc. That's the first point I want to make. Second point I want to make is that global institutions would function better if say India and Japan were admitted to the Security Council. I think a Security Council without India and without Japan simply doesn't recognise the world as it currently is. The third point I'd make is that please, let's not put these institutions on a pedestal. I mean, the International Court does not operate like a global version of the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council. We are not talking about a court of justice. We're talking about a court of politics. And the most obvious example is the recent decision to treat identically the Prime Minister of democratic Israel pursuing a just war against a terrorist organisation and the leaders of that terrorist organisation. This idea that the now dead leader of Hamas should be subject to no more sanction than the democratic leader of Israel shows just how flawed so many of these global institutions are.
Wonderful. Mr. Abbott, let me turn to the Indo-Pacific region, which has become an increasingly contested area with increased economic and coercion in the South China Sea. What's your view on this and this very, very aggressive stance by China? How do Australia and India work together, and what more can be done in the Indo-Pacific region?
Well, you're right. China is increasingly assertive, to put it at its kindest. Belligerent, I think, is a more accurate description. And the most recent example of this is a Chinese naval task force that has just sailed down the east coast of Australia without any prior warning or notice to the Australian government. 2 live-fire exercises which massively disrupted air transport across the Tasman Sea. And this is typical of, I suppose, China attempting to let all its neighbours know who the big dog is. I mean, what we've seen in recent times is traditional Chinese exceptionalism married to Marxism-Leninism, and the Beijing government's attitude to all its neighbours is tremble and obey. That's their attitude. So we've got to be conscious of just what we're dealing with here. This is where I think India can really step up. I mean, India's always been the superpower of the subcontinent, but if you look at India's history, it's always acted with great forbearance. Notwithstanding many provocations, there's been no aggression against Pakistan. India's actions in the 1971 war was really a humanitarian effort that resulted in the liberation of Bangladesh. I think India has been an exemplary global citizen, and as I said earlier, it's well and truly assimilated democracy and the rule of law. I mean, India is living, breathing proof that you don't need to be a dictatorship to progress, that a very large and disparate country can be a functioning liberal democracy, indeed a very efficient liberal democracy. So I like to think that in the decades to come, India will count for much more in the world, that India's global role will increasingly reflect its economic clout. And as I've said on numerous occasions, if there is to be a leader of the free world in 50 years' time, it's as likely to be the Prime Minister of India as the President of the United States, particularly if the United States engages in a kind of strategic retreat.
Okay. Thanks for that outlook and that perspective. And I wanted to turn to the Australia-India relationship, and the Australia-India Economic and Trade Cooperation Agreement was a landmark deal. What more can be done to accelerate the pace of greater benefits between Australia and India relationship?
Well, Amitabh, I was really pleased to host Prime Minister Modi in Australia back in 2014. That was the first visit by an Indian Prime Minister to Australia in some 27 years, and it was far too long a gap. It was a tremendous success. Modi got a rock star welcome in Australia, and I've got to say the million or so Australians of Indian background have been absolutely model, exemplary Australians, and I think that's going to continue. I think that India has the potential to step up as China, so to speak, steps back. I think the trade relationship between Australia and India is underdeveloped. I had a bit to do with the trade deal that was finalised a couple of years back, the interim trade deal that was finalised a couple of years back. And I think the Minister on the Australian side and the wonderful Piyush Goyal, who was the Minister on the Indian side, were only too keen to get a deal. But unfortunately, bureaucrats and vested interests have a wonderful way of complicating things. Bureaucrats because they want to keep the negotiations going forever, because while the negotiations are happening, that empowers the officials, and vested interests because they never want to disturb their cosy little arrangements. And my way of getting a free trade deal is to have a list of all the various products, the current tariffs, and just cross out 15% and put in 0%. Cross out 150%, which there was on Australian wine at that time, and put in, at least in the short term, maybe 20%, reducing ultimately to 0%. And I just think that's what we need more of. I mean, why shouldn't two countries that really are so much at one on so many things have completely free trade in goods, very substantial mutual recognition of qualifications, and at least above a certain wage level, relatively free movement of people. I think
the Indians love the Australian wines. They're available in plenty.
And we'd be very happy to see more of them.
The two things Indians love.
Speaking of Australian wines, I hope there's some being served this evening, and let's not too long delay our opportunity to enjoy them.
So the two things Indians love is, one, the Australian cricketers. So the champion trophy is going on right now. Who do you think is going to win it, Australia or India?
Well, if I say what my heart tells me, I'll be very unpopular. And if I say what you want me to say, I'll probably be very embarrassed when I get back home. So cricket will be the winner.
Well, let me ask you then as to how do you rate the present Australian cricket team, and how do you rate the present Indian team?
I think they're respectively the two best teams in the world.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So they should be playing in the finals then.
Let's hope.
Yeah. Sure. So thank you very much for that wonderful discussion. I was really impressed with your very visionary and very, very dynamic perspective which you spelled out today, and it's been such a pleasure and such a delight interacting with you. You're such a popular figure in India. It's always a delight to interact with you.
Well, thank you, Amitabh, and can I just congratulate you? You were very important to the success of India's G20, so well done.
Thank you so much. Great pleasure.
I just request you to stay back, both of you, for a second on stage. Amitabh Kant and Prime Minister Abbott, I just request you to just take your seat for a second. We have 2-3 questions from the audience, although it has been a very all-encompassing discussion where you've spoken about diplomacy, cricket, and of course wine as well. But we do have 2 or 3 audience questions which we'll very, very quickly take. Megha has the mic, and who's asking the first one? Yes, there, the young man there. Yes.
Hello. Thank you so much, both of you, for the insightful conversation you had. My name is Mantha, and I'm one of the Shoresman scholars. And my question is very brief. The world that we are growing in right now is becoming increasingly polarized with Mr. Trump, the conflicts in Gaza, Ukraine, the AI coming in, and so on and so forth. in the theme of the next conference, of the theme of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, what according to you is the way to make the world less polarized? How would you bring Mr. Trump, Xi, Modi and all together in this world? Thank you.
Well, that's a really good question. And to go back to probably one of the very great democratic leaders of all time, I know he wasn't always popular here, Winston Churchill. Churchill said, jaw, jaw is better than war, war. What he was meaning was that while you're talking, at least you're not fighting. And I think it's important to be realistic about your interlocutors, and I think we need to understand that President Putin does want to restore Russian domination of Eastern Europe. I think he does want to recreate as far as he can the Russia of Peter the Great. And there is no doubt that President Xi is burning to end what he sees as the century of humiliation, and that means next taking Taiwan by force if necessary, and over time, because he said it often and often, over and over again, establishing China as the world's #1 power, and that obviously has implications for India with a disputed border with China. So look, I think conferences like this are obviously a help, and I think all global meetings that involve people speaking candidly and try to see things from the other person's perspective are a help. But in the end, the only way to guarantee no fighting is to surrender. And I don't think we should be prepared to surrender when it comes to freedom, justice, and national independence.
All right, that's a prediction of you of what's coming up next. I think we'll take one final question. Yes.
Hello, Prime Minister Abbott. Ariel Lawrence, CEO of the Asclepian Group, and an American. So as you have spoken to, President Trump has been critical of alliances like NATO and has questioned the value of global institutions with key allies for decades. If United States foreign policy continues to embrace an isolationist stance, does this represent a strategic opportunity for India on the world stage, or does it burden India's continued development? What role should India play in maintaining regional order? And should India prepare to take on a larger security role in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, if America steps back, I think it'll be important for other countries to step up. President Trump's early moves have had the beneficial impact of reminding the British and the French that they should be doing more to secure the ultimate freedom of Ukraine. And if America were to step back globally, well, I think it would be wonderful if India would step up. And I think under Modi, India's instinct is to step up. As I say, if there is going to be a leader of the free world in 50 years' time, if the free world is still to be free in 50 years' time, it will be because countries other than America, other than Britain, have done their bit. And, you know, this is where I think India has really wonderfully assimilated democracy and the rule of law. I mean, not just that. I mean, India is now an absolute beacon when it comes to literature and so on. So look, I think modern India is a remarkable place, and the more India steps up, the better for all of us.
All right, well, let's leave it at that. Thank you so much for agreeing to take some of our audience questions as well, Prime Minister Abbott. It's truly been a riveting discussion. Thank you once again for being with us as our guest of honor at the NXT 2025. And thank you so much, Amitabh Kant, for moderating this session. Your questions truly did provide a lot of course, fodder for Tony Abbott to answer and really share his perspective on numerous issues. Thank you very much for that session. A quick photo up of these two dignitaries who've joined us at NXT 2025. And once again, thank you very much for being with us today. All right, let's move forward now. Let's hear it for them once again. Yes. Okay, let's move forward now. We are, of course, picking up important themes, forward-looking themes, futuristic themes throughout our two-day summit, as you have been seeing, of course, through the day today, and you will see tomorrow too. So we're continuing that, and now we want to speak about mobility. Yes, for our next session of Next in Mobility, we're going to be having a presentation from two very, very spirited individuals. And they're going to be, of course, speaking to us about their vision forward. For this, I want to invite, for this special presentation, Dr. Christian Gasparich with us. She's partner at Kearney. And we also have Mr. Anshuman Sinha with us. Let's have you on stage as well. He's partner in India, head automotive, transportation and infra for Kearney. Let's welcome both of them with a round of applause, please.